Welcome, students. We're now doing some readings on pornography, and I'd like to say a few things about this before we start. One is that I'm sorry if this is offensive to anyone. In our class especially, but in college in general, it's a little hard to avoid offensive or otherwise difficult material. On the other hand, there's no point going through difficult, disturbing, whatever exactly it is material if there's not some use to it, right? We're not out here just to shock or offend or to be provocative just for its own sake. There has to be some point to go through these readings. So, there's an apology here if you find this reading too much. On the other hand, there's a reason I'm doing it, so try to bear with it, just like you would every other reading, because there is sort of a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. There's a reason why we do this. Second point is that we can use this reading to talk about other issues as well. So we can use it to talk about prostitution and whether prostitution should be legal or illegal. There's related issues around that, but that's a primary one. So our two authors, MacKinnon and McElroy, they focus on pornography, but it's almost like a cousin issue, right, of prostitution. So we'll raise questions about that ourselves as well. That's a second point. Third point is this. These two are just applying Mill to the issue of of pornography. So one of the uses of this reading is it helps us understand Mill in practice, in application, and that's where Mill gets really interesting. I mean, frankly, the harm principle is right. It's correct. You should be able to do what you want in general, except for harm others or prevent them from doing what they want. Great. But it's not that interesting until we apply it to specific issues. Does smoking harm other people? Not if you do it alone in your own home. Well, what if I do it in public? Does the increased risk of cancer to other people, is that a harm, right? Is that really a harm? Is an adult seeing other people have consensual sex harmful? Probably not. Is the system which that kind of thing, pornography is actually produced in, does it increase the rates of prostitution, human trafficking, and rape and abuse of women? Yeah, probably, right? Okay, well then it's something we have to take seriously. So as I said, this is going to be a sort of application of Mill. Both MacKinnon and McElroy are philosophers and scholars in their own right, but what they're doing here is they're showing, hey, I think Mill is correct about the basics, right? Like Mill is the guy to go to on this issue, and then they apply it. So part of why we're doing this is to see how Mill works in practice a little bit better. Part of why we're doing it is to talk about controversial but important issues like prostitution and pornography, issues around sexuality. Another reason that I have is something I pointed out before in our class, but it bears nearly infinite repeating. And what it is that I want to repeat now is that for an issue, guns, sex, pornography, all these sort of things, it's never so simple as just pro and con. Right? The issue here is not whether we should ban pornography or allow it with no limits. That would be like the most simplistic pro-con thing. So I think no one's saying guns should just be flat out banned. I mean, almost no one. Nor is almost anyone saying there should be zero limits. Everyone, felons, children, right? The psychopaths, right? It's not just yes or no. Like, do you love guns or hate guns? No. Do you hate pornography or love pornography? So it's never just so simple as yes, no. Okay? Even McElroy, who's pretty like, yes, pornography's fine, leave it alone, places some limits on it. And students always read MacKinnon as saying, well, we should ban pornography. That's not what she's saying. Because, again, who most people don't have on issues, should we ban it or fully allow it? It's always somewhere in the middle, right? And Mill really helps us see that, is that that no answer is so simple as yes or no. Okay. Another point related to that one I just made is that our class shows that there isn't just a yes or no on issues. You didn't just wake up one day and go, abortion is bad. It's that before you ever started thinking about abortion, like when you were a kid, there were certain general ethical principles that you were absorbing. Certain general moral stances and views that you were absorbing from the culture at large, from your parents, from your church, from your friends, whatever. Then when someone said, hey, there's this thing called abortion, what do you think about it? You already came to it with your own personal values and moral, ethical stances. Then when you heard about the particular object of abortion or pornography or gun control, you applied your already existing moral values to it. Trust me, that's just how it works. You're not born thinking abortion is a woman's free choice, nor were you born thinking that abortion is the taking of an innocent life. Okay, you already had values that then when you were confronted with that issue, you ran the issue through your own existing values. So this is why it's not that there's a yes or a no on every issue. It's that there's a whole bunch of different values. There's conservative Christian, there's liberal Christian, there's secular humanism, there's Mill-style utilitarianism, Bentham-style utilitarianism, Aristotle, Augustine, Plato, Nietzsche, Epictetus, the list goes on and on. There's a whole bunch of different core values that sort of cluster together in Western civilization. And odds are you got one of those packages of values. You got conservative Christian, you got libertarian, you got liberal left of center with a strong emphasis on education. I don't know. However you were raised, whatever you thought was most compelling in your culture. That's what we want to see in this class. A reflection on a specific issue, not just to line up and say, raise your hand if you're for it, raise your hand if you're against it. But for you to reflect on, since you're for or against it in specific ways, then trace backwards from that to the core underlying values. Do you think that education is good? Do you think that freedom is good? If so, why? Do you think that your freedom is generally compatible with other people's freedom, like it enhances other people's freedom? Or do you think that other people's freedom is a risk to yours that you have to be protected from? Right? We want to trace back to the starting point, the core values that you have, so that you can reflect on those and come to know yourself better. So, using Mill as both pro and con on this issue shows you that what really drives people is their interpretation of their core values. Not the yes or no to an individual issue, but the core values that back up and sustain and support that issue. So, it's so far from being the case that there's simply yes or no on an issue, that for every moral, core moral position, Aristotle, Mill, right? Add up all these names we're reading for the class. That within each one of those you can develop a yes or no position. So there's actually an infinity of positions, at least two per, moral grouping, like around Mill or around Aristotle, around whoever. There's actually an infinity of values that lead to these positions. So it's a lot more complicated than should we have a law banning it or are we fine with it and just let it be. There's an infinity of other options or approaches. So let's see what MacKinnon says, and let's see what McElroy's response is. So as always, you're supposed to do the readings before you listen to the recordings. Since you've done that, you'll notice that McElroy names MacKinnon by name. So I know their names are similar and it's hard to tell them apart. McElroy is the one who's basically fine with pornography, the second reading. MacKinnon is the one who says pornography is a harm and therefore should be regulated. So let's start with MacKinnon. MacKinnon says that in our culture, it's not a level playing field. And there's all sorts of detailed studies. We won't get into them here, but women get paid less for similar work as men, and women are perceived by men and women both as talking more than they really do. Men are perceived as saying more intelligent things or having more right answers even when they have the wrong answer. And I won't go into all the details because there's a million studies and it's disputed how to understand them and read them. And you can get more of that in a sociology class, for instance. Okay? But something that I think we can all agree is true and that we can all agree is totally disturbing is that sexual violence affects women at a much higher rate than it does men. I think the most current statistics on this is that a woman who goes to college, her odds, I can't remember if these are lifetime odds or just while she's in college, but are 1 in 5 of being sexually assaulted. That's crazy high. Now, men get sexually assaulted too in college and otherwise, but the rate's not nearly so high. So just think of that. Think of your closest 5 female friends. This isn't quite how statistics work, but if you think of 5 of your closest female friends, the odds are good that one of them has been sexually assaulted, raped, sexually harassed, something, while she was in college. In just those 4 years. That's before most people are 22. So then imagine all the years left that she has in her life where that the other 4 might be raped, assaulted, etc. Okay, so all these other differences, we'll leave those aside, but that's something very disturbing. And that's something that clearly has some sort of gender or sex component to it. So part of what MacKinnon is saying on this first page, I know this first page rubs a lot of people the right way. They're like, what's she talking about? She's saying that women don't live in the same world as men, that they don't have equal rights, etc. And she would just say, well, look, if the odds are because of what kind of person you are, you're more likely to be raped. That's not a fair world. If that falls on you not randomly, but because of who you are as a person, that's not a fair world. And part of what she means there too is when women try to voice these concerns and say, hey, this is the world I live in, where I'm scared to walk at home by myself, where I'm scared when my boyfriend loses his temper that he might beat me and maybe beat me to death, because that happens. I've never been scared that my partner was going to beat me to death, right? I've never been scared to walk home alone. So that's part of what she's saying, because I know that first page rings people's ears the wrong way. They think she's saying, oh, men hate women, or the world's sexist and it isn't fair. And what she's pointing to are just a few very specific things. Our reading is a shortened version, so it's not so clear, but that's what she's saying. She's not saying the world's all completely against women or that men hate women or anything like that. She's saying there are certain clear differences that work out against women consistently. So that's her first general point. Her second point is when you look at pornography, what you see is exactly those things, exactly those injustices that fall not randomly on people in the world, but fall on women. In pornography, you see the exact same kind of stuff. So as she says on 206 at the top, she says, in pornography, in one place, all of the abuses that happen way more to women than to men all the abuses that people don't want to talk about and don't want to admit happen, all that unspeakable abuse shows up in pornography. Rape, assault, sexual harassment, prostitution, and sexual abuse of children. She says, pornography sexualizes crime. All those things are crimes, right? Pornography sexualizes crime, and it eroticizes the general dominance and submission that happens to women. So, just a few things here again. She's working within Mill, and Mill says you can do whatever you want, even if it's immoral, shameful, gross, stupid, so long as you don't hurt another person. So you can hurt yourself if you want. You can do things immoral that offend or gross out other people if you want, as long as it doesn't rise up to the level of harm. So her basic claim is going to be that pornography harms women. Her claim isn't that it's gross or that it's morally wrong or that it's sinful to have sex for money outside of marriage. Nothing like that. She says that pornography, in fact, harms women. Now, a little more detail. You'll want to write this down because it's easy to miss in the reading, but it's very important. She says there's specifically two different kinds of harm that happen to women. The first one is the kind of harm that happens to the women who are in pornographic movies themselves. That's going to be the harm of coercion. C-O-E-R-C-I-O-N. So this first kind of harm that happens just to the actresses in pornographic movies is that they're often coerced into the work. And coercion just means the lack of freely given consent. Basically, coercion is where you do something that you really did not want to do. You're sort of forced into doing it. So that's the first harm that she talks about. The second kind of harm that she talks about is the harm to women in general. Or sorry, it's just two types. It's not really in order of when they happen. The second type of harm that she talks about is the generalized harm that comes to women. And her point here is that images show us what we can do in the world. And if you see enough images that show women being used in a certain way, and literally used in a certain way, you're going to have an increased tendency to treat actual women, so not images, but actual women that way. So if you see women being treated like objects in pornography, or women treated as objects, literally as objects in pornography, you're slightly more likely to do that in real life to real women. Well, you treat people as objects, then you're harming their freedom. That's a different kind of harm. So, since there's two different harms, two different groups of people harmed, we have to treat them separately. Okay, we have to treat them as different points, or else we'll lose what she says and it'll become less convincing and we won't actually hear her points. Okay? The first point I'd like to treat about the women in pornographic movies is this. I'm not going to list off, okay, I'm not going to list off the things that happen in pornography. I'm sure a few of you have heard about what happens in pornography. And if you haven't heard or haven't ever seen it, you feel free, you're in your home by yourself right now, I'm sure, to research what happens in pornography. But if you know, or when you come to know when you do this research, you'll see that it's very common in pornographic movies for women to be treated like lower than human. So there's physical things that happen to women. They're grabbed. They're thrown around. They're forced to do things that cause them pain. again, I don't want to be too graphic, especially I'm not in the room with you. It'd be harder for me to tell when I'm about to cross a sort of line with you. So again, apologies in advance if I do cross a line, but the point is here we have to talk about what pornography actually is if we're going to talk about what it is acceptable or not. Okay? So, without being too graphic, if you know how pornography movies nowadays typically end, there's one very specific way that they tend to end, and this is with the woman literally and metaphorically on her knees. Again, I'm trying not to be too graphic here. And apologies if I am being too graphic. So, what MacKinnon says is pornography in general, and it's not like 51% of the time, but like 90% of the time, 95% of the time, is very much a one-way street. Where the man is doing things, and the woman is having things done to her. So this is before when I said, women are treated like objects in pornography, and then I corrected myself. I said, no, they're actually treated as objects. What I mean there is it's not a metaphor. We don't just say a woman's a sexual object in MacKinnon because like she's being looked at. What she means is women are treated as objects, like they are picked around and moved up without their permission. You hit them, you grab them, you toss them around in a way you wouldn't do to a person, right? But in pornography, that's the stock image of the way the woman is treated. Same thing, there's, once more without going into too much detail, but not ignoring what pornography is, there's whole huge chunks of pornography that are about women who are supposed to look like they're underage. Either they're dressed up like Catholic schoolgirls or cheerleaders, right? Most of you don't do the cheer squad anymore in college. It's something you did in high school when you were underage. They're called the girl next door, right? So there's this sexualization of underage women. So there's a sexualization of violence against women and dominance of women, using women as objects to be thrown away when you're done with them. Okay? And so once more, just to summarize a few points she's making. She's trying to talk about harm. If it's just gross or immoral pornography, she's got nothing to say about it because Mill and America in general have nothing to say about other people's immorality. It's not our business. But if something harms someone else, then we all have something to say. It's a matter of justice. We all have to respond. What she's saying is if you look at what pornography is in general, surely there's exceptions, but we're talking the vast majority of pornography here. Things happen to women that paint them as people who are not giving permission for these things to happen and are not capable of giving consent because, for instance, they're underage. So another way to put this is to think about it this way. Think about the things you've seen in pornography. And not even the wildest, craziest stuff, just whatever counts as normal for you, sort of typical pornography. Then ask yourself, is there any way you would ever do those things for money? Okay? The concept here is what's called coercion versus consent. Okay? Consent is when you freely choose to do something. So think of consent like a valid contract. Okay? You and I might have a valid contract that says, I want my house painted, you want money. You come and paint my house, I'll give you money. Now, you probably wouldn't paint my house just for free, like just because, right? And I wouldn't give you money just because. You can count on that. But when you and I agree on something through a valid contract, which has consent behind it, then it's totally legitimate. So consent is the free and willing giving up of freedom or choice in exchange for somebody else doing it. So once more, I would not give you money randomly. I would not freely choose to give you money randomly, just like you would not freely choose to paint my house randomly. But if you and I come together and agree on terms, through consent, I consent to give up my freely earned money to you, and you consent to give up your freely given time, and we exchange them. And that's fine. In fact, that's better than fine. That's how half of everything works, right? Okay, so consent is good. Consent is when two people get together and they do things that they might not do otherwise, but in this case, they have freely consented in a contract to do those things for each other. That's consent. It's how contracts work, and it's great. There's sections on consent, by the way, in the mill reading we've done. Coercion, though, is basically fake consent. Coercion is when something's set up to look like there's freely given consent when there's really not. So I was just watching a show last night that had crime stuff in it, and you know how the mob does this? They come to your place of business and they say, "Oh, it's a nice business you have here. It'd be a shame if it burnt down." And you're the business owner, you're like, "Yeah, stranger, it sure would be a shame if it burnt down." And what they say is, we can protect your building. Okay, this is called protection money. They say, we can protect your building. We can make sure it doesn't burn down if you just freely choose to give us some money. If you don't freely choose to give us some money, well, it's a pretty good chance that this place will burn down. So this is coercion, where you sort of pretend to let the person choose, but you're threatening them in some way, or they're somehow in a position where they don't really genuinely have a choice. I mean, would you call yourself perfectly free if the giant muscly mobster guy who has a gun on him comes to your place and says, either pay me money or your place might get burnt down? Most of us would call that coercion and say, yeah, I gave him money, but I didn't freely consent to give him money. I was forced to do it. That's what we mean by coercion. So we can change the earlier example of consent with you painting my house and me paying you into one of coercion by just, I'm your teacher, right? If I said, hey, come to my house and paint it, I'll even pay you. If you don't, it'd be a real shame, because I think your grade in this class might suffer. So yes, technically you could choose to get an F in my class to not paint my stupid house, but I'm not really giving you a real choice there, right? So, consent is when you sign a normal contract, you freely choose to do something for someone else that you might not otherwise do, but you've chosen to do in this case. And then, yeah, you're held to that contract. But if I have a gun to your head and ask you to sign a contract, that's a coerced contract and it does not count. It doesn't count at all. Any judge, if they see video of you signing something with, say, a gun to your head, or there's otherwise an implicit threat, they'll say that's coercion. They'll tear the contract up for you. That's how little standing it has. Okay, so now we apply all this to pornography, and we can apply it to prostitution as well. I'll be honest with you, class, I don't think I'd ever have sex for money. I might take out the trash for someone. I might do custodial work. I would do manual labor, right? Like I'd dig ditches or something like that. There's all sorts of things I'd do for money that maybe other people wouldn't. I'd be a boxer for money if I was any good at it. Not everyone's willing to get punched in the head for money, but I'd do it. So I would consent freely to those kinds of jobs, and not everyone else would. But I would not consent to have sex, have it recorded for money. That's pornography. Nor would I consent to have sex with strangers for money. That's prostitution. The whys of it don't matter, okay? The whys of it don't matter. So what that means is, if you ever find me prostituting myself or doing pornography, I was coerced into doing it somehow. That's not something I would ever freely do for money. I would never consent freely to do that. That's why I asked you before, do you think that you would ever prostitute yourself or take money for pornography, no matter how bad your situation was? And you do not have to answer this. This is not a discussion question, but I bet for a lot of you the answer is no. Okay, so you would never do it for money, probably. I would never do it for money. People are out there doing it for money, though. So already, this is not an airtight argument I'm about to make, but already there's an implication that maybe the people doing it are coerced. Right? If it's something that you can't imagine anyone in their right mind doing for money, maybe the people doing it aren't in their right mind or aren't really freely doing it, but have somehow been forced to do it, say, at the point of a gun. Now, if that's the case, if pornography and prostitution are coerced, so they're like fake contracts, unfree arrangements, then that for sure is a harm for Mill. Just like Mill would say it's a harm and therefore should be prevented and punished, when the mobster comes to your business and says, it'd be a shame if something bad happened to this lovely business you have. Okay? So pause here and think, do you think there's anything like that going on in pornography? Okay, do you think there's any reason to think that pornography and prostitution are coercive business arrangements? Now, often I don't, in classes in the past, I haven't focused enough on the actual details of, how do I want to say, the business side of pornography. I described the bad things that happen in pornography, and students completely correctly would push back and they'd say, hey, I wouldn't do it, but I wouldn't be a soldier for money. Sorry, I'm too scared. I wouldn't be a cop for money. Sorry, it's too dangerous. Right? I wouldn't be a writer for money. Sounds like a boring job to me, right? So people go, this will be a point that McElroy will like. They'll say, I don't know what's going on in other people's head. I don't know why someone wants to have sex for money. But I can't assume it's coercion just because I wouldn't do it. Do you know what I mean? Let's say you don't like heavy metal music. You wouldn't assume that someone else saying they like it is lying, right? You wouldn't assume they've been coerced into listening to heavy metal music. You would just say, like Mill says, we're all allowed to pursue our enjoyments however we want. Everyone's different. This, though, is how the business side of pornography and prostitution helped make MacKinnon's case. And in her longer article, she does talk about this at some length. In actual pornography and prostitution, a lot of the women have issues with drug and alcohol abuse. Probably just drug abuse mostly. Now, you can look up statistics. I don't have them ready to hand because I'm not a statistics guy. But it's pretty widely agreed upon that there is more drug abuse in pornography and prostitution than the general population. Okay, well, what do people do when they have drug problems? They will turn to whatever they can in order to pay for their drugs, right? They'll turn to crime. They'll turn to selling their bodies for money. Now, if that's just something that you and I wouldn't do, Mill says, hey, leave it alone. So would MacKinnon. Here's the thing, though. If you are intoxicated and you sign a contract, it works just like it was coerced. Because we say you're allowed to make your own decisions when you're in your right state of mind. So if you're having a psychotic episode and you make someone a promise or sign a contract, we say it's just like coercion, even if you weren't coerced. We say that person's not really giving free consent because they're not in their right mind. Or if someone's drunk or high, if someone's completely high out of their mind and they want another hit and you say, I'll give you $400 right now if you give me your car. And they say, yeah, man, yeah. And they go off and get high more. Sorry, that's not fair, right? You've taken advantage of someone who isn't really making free decisions. It's sort of like the drugs are making the decisions for them, right? Okay, so now we have a little more concrete evidence that pornography and prostitution are in fact coercive or lack free consent. Because if someone's an addict, it's not really them speaking and making decisions, but the drugs making the decisions. And the women involved in this are in fact addicted to drugs at a much higher rate. So here's another aspect of it. And this one's a little harder to track down, but especially for women engaged in prostitution, but also for some women in pornography as well. Once they get involved, the men behind the scenes won't let them leave. So maybe the woman's just trying to pay rent, or she was addicted to drugs and then got off of them, right? And she says, I'm done with this. Well, often a pimp or somebody making money off this woman having sex with people is going to say, I'm not going to let this go. You make a lot of money for me. And he'll force her to somehow stay and keep doing this stuff because it benefits him. Now, I can't prove how often this happens. I don't think it's hard to believe, though, that often once a woman gets involved in these sort of situations, that the men dealing with this are not always the most savory characters, and that they might threaten this woman and say, now you're in. Again, we can use mobster examples if we want. Once you join the mob, you go, I've made plenty of money. I'm going to retire now. They don't let you retire. They blackmail you. They threaten your family. Once you're in, you're in. Okay. So that's another way in which the consent of the actresses might not be freely given consent. Maybe they wanted to do it initially, but then they're stuck there against their will once they've been there for a little while. And a final way, this one's pretty touchy. I mean, it's all touchy. But a final way that women involved in pornography and prostitution might not be giving full free consent is that a lot of them come from sexually abused backgrounds. So that is literally someone has harmed them at a point in the past, and as a way of trying to cope with that harm, they try to control it by sort of repeating it more on their own terms. This is one way of understanding how people respond to sexual abuse, is that they then modify their sexual desires and sexual practices to sort of engage in certain acts that are somehow like the abuse that they suffered. But if they're the one making it happen, then it feels like control to them. But I think we can say that if the behavior is caused by rape or sexual assault or incest when the girl is young, and then she's repeating that behavior later in pornography or prostitution, that a bit like drugs, that's probably not her real freedom, right? That's probably not who she really wants to be and how she wants to act. It's probably her coping mechanism mentally of trying to deal with it, but a bad one, right? Okay, so that's MacKinnon on why the actresses are probably in some way or another unfreely participating in it. They're being coerced into the action. Okay. But here we'll pause and ask a question. We get lots of back and forth between MacKinnon and McElroy, so I'll ask you a more general question. What difference do you see between prostitution and pornography? Okay. What moral difference, if any, do you see between prostitution and pornography? So, what difference do you see between prostitution and pornography? But I'm going to ask this at two different levels. And with all discussion questions, you don't have to talk about all of the things I asked. Just talk about what you think is most interesting. Okay. At a moral level, we can see what are the differences, if any. We also want to ask at a legal level, should there be any difference? Okay. So again, what difference, if any, do you see between pornography and prostitution? Is one more or less moral than the other? And from a legal standpoint, should one be legal with an L and the other one illegal with an I? Should they both be legal? Should they both be illegal? Okay? So that's the basic question. Just a quick little follow-up on that. It's really tempting in Mill, because he rightly emphasizes that everybody is different, to just say, well, I feel this way, but other people might feel differently. You can say that if you want, but we all know that at this point, right? We all know that everyone thinks differently about these issues, and we've seen in the discussion so far that you all are very respectful of each other and want to give each other space. But we don't have to, you don't have to declare for other people that they might disagree with you. They'll do that if they want to, right? So on this, we want to say how we feel and try to say why we feel that way. So I'd much rather see people trying to say why they think the way they feel makes good sense, and less time declaring for other people that they might disagree. Because they'll give their own disagreement if they want. And plus, what's sometimes missing when we immediately rush to say, hey, but you're allowed to think differently, is we forget to say why we think the way we do. So don't forget to say why, because that's the most important thing to me. And I find it's the most interesting thing for your other students too. Okay. So a little more on MacKinnon now. This second point I find is often even more controversial, sort of disputed by students than the first. And this is MacKinnon's claim that since pornography shows women being harmed, it leads to harm of the general population of women in general. And this is one of the points that McElroy hits hard back against. Okay, so we'll treat McElroy later in a second. But MacKinnon says certain actions are shaped by what you see in other people. So, for instance, she says that pornography succeeds in constructing our social reality. She says, that's page 207A. On 206B, she says, the object world is constructed according to how it looks with respect to its possible uses. So pornography defines women by how they look, according to how they can be sexually used. Now, this is pornography, not everything, but just pornography. She continues and she says, pornography codes how to look at women so you know what you can do with one once you see one. Right? So this is one of her major points is this. She says, yes, people are free, and it's not like if you see a violent movie, you go out and you stab someone. Nor if you see pornography where the woman's being treated roughly and you're a guy, that you just like pick up the next woman you see and treat her roughly. So a lot of people have a real problem with this point. But I think we can give a little more credence to it. First, we just have to note, she's not saying just simply that pornography causes sexual violence. It's not stimulus response, monkey see, monkey do. It's more like if it's the nature versus nurture question that we can always return to, it would be like pornography is, wow, nurture is a weird way to put it here, but it's that sort of environmental shaping of us, that environmental factor. Right? It's not that it just causes you or forces you to be violent, but that it would sort of nudge you or maybe encourage latent violent tendencies that someone might already have. And that to me seems more believable than some sort of like porn causes rape or something. So she gives even more detail and support to this. Think about, if you will, your first kiss. So stop thinking about pornography and start thinking about your first kiss. It was probably awkward. For some of us, it was a long time ago, but try to think about your first kiss. So probably for your first kiss, you approached it sort of like you'd seen in movies. I mean, if you can remember your first kiss, you could ask yourself this question. Did it look at all like kisses you've seen in movies before? Did you put your hand maybe on the back of the other person's neck, or tilt your head without knowing why, right? Or close your eyes before it happened, right? Okay, these are not like biological instincts. They're things that we've seen from watching other people kiss. So when we did it, when we kissed for the first time, you probably sort of unconsciously, in part, mimicked what you'd seen visually in movies about romantic kissing. All right, not that when Harry Met Sally made you kiss the way they kissed, but just that it's part of like your background of how you're like, I don't know how to do this. I've never done this before. Maybe this is how I'm supposed to do it. So now apply that to pornography. Yes, there's a biological urge to have sex with other people, but it's not like you really know what's good or what the other person wants or how it works. But nowadays, if you're a boy, you've probably seen a lot of pornography before you had sex. Then think, again, not about pornography in the abstract, but what actual pornography actually looks like. If young boys are growing up consuming that kind of pornography, and they think that that's normal sexual behavior, or even if they know it's not normal, but now they have the desire to do these things, desires that would have occurred to them if they hadn't seen all this different stuff. And then they do those things to a girl who does not want those things done to her. Then pornography has helped, did not cause, but has helped a guy go too far and do something to a girl he's with that she did not consent to and did not want. Now, since this would be very traumatic for people involved, again, I won't ask you in the discussion board, but you can ask yourself and you can ask your friends about this. How many of your female friends have had something happen to them when they're having sexual relations with a guy? Doesn't have to be sex, but sexual relations. That was unwelcome, painful, that they did not want. Something that a guy had seen or wanted because he'd seen in one of these movies. How many of you or your female friends have ever felt pressured by a guy to do something that she really didn't want to do? Once more, we don't need to name all the specifics and details. All right, we just need to reflect on our own personal experience and those of the women we know. So, that's the second kind of harm, and that's the one done to women in general. Okay? Remember, she's not saying that images cause actions all the time. She's also not saying that all pornography does this. What she's saying, though, is that certain images do construct and shape our behavior. She's also saying that the vast majority of porn, it's not some, there will always be exceptions, but it's the vast majority of pornography, shows men hitting women, spitting on women, pulling their hair, calling them names, having sex with them in ways that are in no way possible to be enjoyable or comfortable for the woman. And if men see that enough and it gratifies them sexually, it's probably going to become part of what they want. There's probably not a really clear dividing wall between being turned on by something in pornography and being turned on by an actual sex with your partner. Probably the more and more you see something in pornography, there's at least some bleed over into what you do in your non-video life. Right? Okay, so those are MacKinnon's points, and we spend a little more time on those because, partly because there's students often disagree with her, like strongly, but also because the next reading is mainly about disagreeing with her main points, So then we've already set up McElroy in large part by talking about this. Okay. I'm just going to leave this one as one recording today since it's so sort of seamless. So McElroy pushes back on the two main points that MacKinnon made, the two different kinds of harm that MacKinnon claims happens. Okay? Remember, there's the harm against pornographic actresses and prostitutes, and then there's the harm against women in general, which is basically that boyfriends are going to try out stuff that they've done with prostitutes or try out stuff that they've seen in pornography against a very unwilling girlfriend. Okay? So on the first point, remember what I said. As I said, would you ever freely do these things? Or would you only do these things like become a prostitute or act in pornography? If ever, it would take like a gun to your head. It would take a mobster saying it would be something very bad might happen to you if you don't join our pornography company or whatever. Okay? Now, at one level, that's a really powerful argument. You could probably imagine yourself being a garbage collector. You could probably imagine yourself being, a fast food worker. These jobs that we might not want to do if you had to. You probably can't imagine yourself being a prostitute or pornographic actor. Right? So at one level, I think that's a pretty powerful argument. But what McElroy comes back with is this. This is a very powerful response to her. She says, okay, MacKinnon is saying that no woman in her right mind could engage in being a pornographic actress. Because remember my examples. I said, well, they might be whacked out of their head on drugs. They might be an addict. They might be sexually traumatized by previous sexual abuse and so not acting in healthy ways, right? Like it might be the trauma that's acting, not really them. And remember, too, I believe I made this point before, but it's important, but intoxicated people can't sign contracts, right? We don't hold them to their contracts. And also children. Children are not legally allowed to sign contracts. Or more specifically, they can sign it if they want, but they can walk away from it. They're allowed to break contracts as if they never signed them. Okay? So, what McElroy correctly says is that if MacKinnon is correct, that women who engage in pornography and prostitution for money, if she's correct that they cannot freely consent to that choice, right, because of who they are and what the activity is, she says by saying no woman in her right mind could consent to being a pornographic actress, what she's also saying in the same breath, what MacKinnon's also saying in the same breath, whether she knows it or not, is that women are like lunatics, like children, like addicts, and like the criminally insane. That they're the kinds of people who we do not allow to make certain decisions. Right? That's a pretty powerful response. Okay. This is page 220. She says, the assumption of MacKinnon, who McElroy, the second article, is arguing against. This is page 220. She says, MacKinnon is assuming that those who make the choice to act in pornography movies are so psychologically damaged that they're incapable of true consent. Imagine how insulting this is to women, she says, who have made an unacceptable choice with their bodies. We call them victims, and we say that they're psychologically impaired, that their arguments need not to be taken seriously, their contracts need not be respected, and their choices are totally invalid. So do you see here it's sort of like a mic drop moment for McElroy? MacKinnon's legal strategy was this. The legal strategy was let women who've been in pornography before, if they feel like they were coerced into that contract, they can sue and get past damages for it. And they can claim it was coercive because it's pornography. The argument being no one would freely choose to do that. So if these women did it, it must have been unfree. And you can sue for damages if you're ever coerced into doing something. Okay. And what McElroy says is, hold on, you just said, MacKinnon, that no woman could freely choose to do this. That is, that all women are incapable of free choice, at least in the matters of sexuality. That's almost like saying men can choose who they want to marry, but women can't choose who they want to marry. Or like men can choose who they want to have sex with and ask permission, but women can't consider that kind of question because their brains are damaged by a sex-crazed culture, or they, I don't know, whatever reason you want to supply. This is what McElroy, the second pro-porn, I guess we could say, article, says to the first one, the anti-porn, we could say, article. She says, by trying to protect women from pornography, you've effectively made them like children, saying that they don't get the right to choose what they want to do with their bodies. You've made them like addicts, even when they're not addicts, saying the only way you could make that choice is if you're crazy. We'll protect you from that choice. That is, we'll take your freedom for that choice away from you in order to protect you. So McElroy says, that doesn't sound a lot like Mill, does it? That doesn't sound a lot like feminism, and both these scholars are feminists. Says it doesn't sound much like Mill to take freedom away from people to protect themselves. It doesn't sound much like Mill or America to say this whole group of people is incapable of using their freedom. So, I said this about MacKinnon. I don't know if I said it about McElroy. McElroy also thinks that Mill is basically right about everything. So what she's done here, this is the best way, by the way, to diffuse your opponent's arguments. If you use their own basic principles against them, or you show how they inconsistently apply their own principles, then you're not even saying, I disagree with you. You're telling the other person they don't fully agree with themselves. They've made a mistake somewhere in their logic. So both McElroy and MacKinnon think that John Stuart Mill is the best. He figured out how politics should work. So when McElroy says, you tried to use Mill, but you ended up going against Mill, what she's saying is you violated your own basic political principles in trying to apply them. Right? You've made a mistake in your logic somewhere. So once more, this is McElroy against the first main point, the claim that pornographic actresses are coerced into their contracts. That is, that they're invalid contracts because they lack consent. She says, if that's true, what you're saying is that all women lack consent to make sexual decisions for themselves. Or another way to put this is that all women who make this choice are crazy and therefore don't get to make this choice. Right? MacKinnon's basic point is we might say, okay, suicide is a choice people make that only a crazy person would make. Maybe we might say that. But as bad as having sex for money might be, it's not like killing yourself. It's not something I want to do, but I can imagine somebody else wanting to do it. Right? Okay. So that's McElroy's first rebuttal of MacKinnon. Okay. Her second one is this. Okay. Her second one is, again, using Mill against the other person trying to use Mill. And she says, okay, it's not clear that pornography leads to violence against women. There's stats that say it does. There's stats that say it doesn't. Right? You ever hear this expression, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics? I don't like all this talk today where people go, oh, all science is biased and all professors have an agenda. Oops, right? I get where it's coming from, though. Because for every global warming, you can find stats that say it's real, stats that say it's not. Gun violence in the U.S., you can find stats that say it's an epidemic. You can find stats that say it's not that bad considering how many people live here. Okay? Sexual violence against women, well, oops, all the stats there say it's actually really bad. But you can find stats that say pornography increases that. You can find ones that say pornography decreases sexual violence against women. Now, please note, That's not a knockdown argument right there. Okay? To say, well, who knows? Maybe pornography contributes to harm against women. Maybe it doesn't. You see how it's not an argument that wins all by itself. Because it just says, maybe my opponent's correct, maybe she's not. But you have to understand how it works within the larger framework of John Stuart Mill that McElroy and most Americans thinks is really powerful and really important. Remember, Mill says you can only regulate something if it clearly leads to direct harm against a specific person. You can't regulate things because maybe they might indirectly increase the odds of harm to someone else. So I'll say that again. All by itself, McElroy saying, maybe porn harms women, maybe it doesn't, that's not really an argument for pornography. It's pretty weak. But in the larger context of Mill, who says we only want to regulate things when we're sure they really lead to harm, then it makes it a stronger point for McElroy, and that's how she knows it works. She says maybe video games make kids more likely to be violent, but maybe slightly more likely you're going to regulate video games out of existence because they might maybe sometimes make one kid angry and punch another kid. We really don't want to go down that road, right? So, and that's a point I think you all get. I don't need to elaborate that point. So there's two questions I want to ask you now in response to this. Okay, the question I want to ask first follows on the point that we just made through McElroy. She says, come on, this is America. We don't regulate things that might maybe possibly lead to an increased risk of potential harms against this generic category of women. Right? I mean, if that were the case, we'd regulate all sorts of stuff, right? But here's exactly my question in response to you. We do, in fact, regulate all sorts of stuff. So smoking in public places doesn't give anyone directly cancer. Shoot, it doesn't even give the smoker directly cancer. It just increases the risk that other people might one day get cancer. But we regulate, at least at the city level, we regulate smoking. There's lots of campuses, for instance, on which you can't smoke. There's lots of states that have passed laws that say you can't smoke in public places. You can't smoke within 25 feet, say, of a public building. We have seatbelt laws, and that's about self-harm, right? We have, so anyways, my point is this, is that, yeah, McElroy's right, and she's using Mill, who's really important for America, correctly, when she says, come on, if you want to start regulating things because they might potentially harm other people, you're going to have to ban knives, right? You're going to have to ban fertilizer because it can be used for bombs. That's not how it works. There has to be a definite risk of harm to particular individuals. Then we regulate stuff. On the other hand, we do in fact regulate all sorts of things in America precisely because we think they cause a generalized risk to the population. So do you see how it's sort of crazy that we might regulate secondhand smoke? Because if you worked around it your whole life, maybe it would give you lung cancer, and maybe that lung cancer would kill you. But we don't regulate pornography in any way, even though women are raped and brutalized in our culture quite often, and that there might be a connection between those two. Like, you have to wear a seatbelt so you don't harm yourself in your car, and we're all used to that now and don't complain about it. But that pornography probably involves sex trafficking, which is just sexual slavery, and glorifies sex with young girls, and has boyfriends trying out creepy weirdo stuff with their girlfriends that their girlfriends don't want, and that we just say, no, let it be. Seatbelts are fine, but don't touch my pornography. Right? So, I don't know for sure if I'm phrasing the question correctly. It's more like an observation that I want you to respond to. McElroy makes a good point that we shouldn't regulate things just because they might cause harm. But when we're talking about something that might increase the incidence of rapes against women, and we regulate things like you have to have a permit to be a hairdresser in lots of cities and states, and that you have to have a permit to go fishing so that you don't overfish, which would harm your neighbor, I guess, when they want to go fishing. We regulate all sorts of things because of potential harms. And the potential harm here we're talking about is really serious. Maybe we shouldn't ignore it. So I guess the question would be, since we regulate all these other things because of the potential harms, why not regulate pornography when it's also potentially harmful? Okay, and the third question is easy, but you have to pay attention to how I say it, please. Okay, the question is not, what do you think about pornography? Because I'm sure that'll come out in all the other responses. The question is, in the particular headbutting between MacKinnon and McElroy, in their specific use of Mill, if you can incorporate what you remember about Mill into this, which one do you think makes a better argument? Not which one do you like because she said what you already thought about pornography, but which one do you think applies Mill better? Avoiding coercion and increased risk to women of MacKinnon, or protecting individual decisions in McElroy and not regulating things just because there's a possible risk of harm? So this question is simple. In the arguments presented, not just the final position of yes or no, and in the use of Mill specifically, who do you think makes a stronger article, MacKinnon or McElroy? Okay, thank you, everyone. Sorry, one final question. Since I've done today's recording in one full chunk, and it's about an hour instead of, say, 2 half-an-hour chunks, do you have any preference either way? Would you rather the simplicity of one file where it's all there together, or do you like it when they're broken up into separate files? If there's a strong preference one way or the other, I'll probably go with that preference. So email me, if you would, which one you prefer, one solid file or the same amount of information broken up into multiple files. Okay, thank you, everyone.